The morning it happened was colder than anyone expected. A bitter wind pushed against the faded brick walls of St. Augustine's Hospital, carrying with it the smell of rain-soaked asphalt and something faintly metallic from the harbor nearby. The sky was a washed-out gray, heavy and low, and the sound of distant thunder rolled through the empty parking lot. By 7 o'clock, a small crew of contractors had gathered outside the South Wing, an area that had been shut away for as long as most people could rem. The men stamped their feet for warmth, steam curling from their breath as they spoke in low voices. Behind them, the red plastic fencing trembled in the wind, and a section of the old wing stood in shadow, its windows black with grime. No one had looked through them in decades. At precisely 8, a foreman gave the signal, and the first swing of the sledgehammer landed with a dull, hollow thud. Plaster dust puffed out like breath from an old lung. A second strike followed, then a third, the sound echoing unnaturally in the narrow courtyard. Something about it didn't feel like normal demolition. Even the workers, hardened by years of tearing down walls, seemed quieter than usual, like they were aware they were touching something that was meant to stay untouched. By the fifth blow, a piece of brick loosened, tumbling to the ground and revealing darkness beyond. The foreman leaned in, his face lit only by the pale light bleeding through the morning mist. It was not the emptiness they expected. The air from inside was cold and stale, carrying a faint, sour odor that didn't belong to dust or mildew. One man muttered that it smelled like a room where time had stopped breathing. And then, as the opening widened, a single object slipped forward and landed at their feet with a sharp, metallic clink. No one moved at first. They just stared down at it, the rain beginning to spit against their jackets. The foreman reached for it slowly, brushing away the plaster crumbs, revealing something that would change everything they thought they knew about the old hospital. It would be weeks before anyone outside that courtyard heard what they found. Decades had passed since the wing was sealed, but what lay behind that wall had been waiting untouched all those years. And now at last the silence had been broken. Back in the mid-1950s, before the South Wing was sealed, it was a place alive with the rhythm of hospital life. The smell of antiseptic hung faintly in the air, mingling with the aroma of brewed coffee from the nurses' station. The corridors gleamed under the harsh white lights, and the polished floors reflected the shuffle of shoes and the quiet hum of rolling carts. Among the doctors working there was Dr. Evelyn Hart, a young physician with a calm, steady presence. She was known for her patience, her warm smile, and the way she seemed to remember every patient's name, even the ones she had met only once. She lived just a few streets away, in a small red brick townhouse with a flower box on the window. Neighbors would often see her walking to work in the early morning, her hair pinned neatly, carrying a worn leather satchel. She had a fondness for classical music and sometimes left her windows open in the evenings, letting the notes of a piano drift into the street. People liked her, they trusted her. The South Wing had been her main post. The ward's patients were a mix of long-term recoveries and those awaiting surgeries, and she took time for each one. There was Mr. Callahan, a retired teacher who always had a crossword puzzle on his tray, Mrs. Brooks, who never failed to ask about Evelyn's weekend plans, and a quiet young man named Daniel Weaver, who spent his afternoons sketching in a small notebook. Evelyn's rounds often ended with her leaning over his bed, asking softly if he'd drawn anything new. In those days, the wing was busy but not chaotic. The nurses joked with each other during shift changes, the elevator groaned its familiar complaint, and sunlight poured through the tall windows in late afternoon. Life there was in its own way ordinary. But in the weeks leading up to the closure, Evelyn had begun to notice small, almost imperceptible changes. One night she stayed later than usual, finishing notes at her desk. The corridor outside was quiet, save for the ticking of the wall clock. She heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving past the door. When she stepped out to greet whoever it was, the hall was empty, the air cooler than before. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She told no one, brushing it aside as fatigue. Still, she started keeping a small notebook in her satchel, not medical records, just observations. A remark a patient made, a sudden change in mood, or an odd shift in the air. It was as if she sensed something approaching, though she could never name what it was. And in those pages, written in her careful hand, were the first hints of what might have been waiting behind that wall all along. It began with Daniel Weaver. He was usually the quietest patient in the South Wing, content to sit by his window and draw, his pencil whispering over the page. But one afternoon, Evelyn found him staring not at his sketchbook but at the far end of the corridor. His hands were still, his eyes fixed, unblinking. When she asked what he saw, he shook his head and muttered something she couldn't quite catch. Later, she would remember the way his knuckles had tightened around that pencil until it snapped in two. Mrs. Brooks, the older woman with the easy laugh, had always been a comfort to the staff, chatty, light-hearted, someone who made the long shifts feel short. But in the final month before the closure, her tone shifted. She began asking questions Evelyn didn't know how to answer. "Do you ever hear them at night?" she whispered one evening, glancing toward the ceiling. When Evelyn pressed her, Mrs. Brooks only smiled in a way that wasn't really a smile at all. Even the nurses spoke of oddities in hushed voices. Supplies left on carts went missing, only to reappear neatly arranged in locked rooms. Lights flickered in the same two patient rooms, though the electricians swore the wiring was fine. One night, nurse Margaret Ellison told Evelyn she had seen a figure standing just beyond the glass doors at the end of the hall, a man in a hospital gown, unmoving, his face obscured by shadow. When she stepped closer, the space was empty and the doors were locked from the inside. There was also the sound, faint, rhythmic, and so subtle it could be mistaken for the hum of the ventilation. It came late at night, a soft tapping or shuffling that seemed to move from one end of the wing to the other. Some said it was the pipes. Others swore it came from inside the patient's rooms, though no one was ever awake to hear it directly. Evelyn didn't speak of these things outside the ward. She knew the hospital administration disliked rumors. They unsettled staff, made patients uneasy. But she kept writing in her small notebook. She noted the days when patients seemed more withdrawn, the nights when the corridor felt colder, the moments when she herself felt watched while walking between rooms. Once, while checking on Mr. Callahan, she found him sitting up in bed, staring at his closed door. His crossword lay unfinished on his lap. "They keep telling me to come with them," he murmured without looking at her. When she asked who, his eyes slid toward the hallway and his mouth pressed into a thin, trembling line. It was in those weeks, with these strange and disconnected moments piling one atop another, that the South Wing began to feel less like a ward for the sick and more like a place under some quiet, unseen pressure. Something was building there. And though no one could see it clearly, everyone who spent enough time inside could sense it, like the faint shift in the air before a storm you cannot yet hear. It happened on a Thursday night in late November, the kind of night when the fog rolled in so thick you could barely see the hospital gates from the street. The air outside was damp and heavy, muffling the usual city noises until the only sounds were the distant hiss of tires on wet pavement and the faint hum of the hospital generators inside the South Wing. The halls were dim, lit only by the low yellow glow of the overnight lamps. Most of the patients were asleep. Evelyn was on the late shift, moving slowly down the corridor with a chart tucked under her arm. Margaret, the night nurse, was behind the station desk, her head bent over paperwork. At 11:14 p.m. The lights in room 6 flickered once, twice, then steadied. Evelyn paused outside the door. Room 6 was Daniel Weaver's. She knocked softly and waited. No answer. When she pushed the door open, the bed was empty. His sketchbook lay open on the sheets, a pencil rolled onto the floor. Margaret swore she had checked the room less than 10 minutes earlier. Evelyn searched the bathroom, the closet, even under the bed, but Daniel was nowhere. They checked the hallway, then the stairwell at the far end, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The security guard on duty insisted no one had passed through the main doors. Then the pager on Margaret's hip crackled to life. a call from room 9. It was Mrs. Brooks pressing her call button. When Evelyn arrived, Mrs. Brooks was sitting upright, eyes wide, her hands gripping the blanket. "He was here," she whispered, her voice trembling, "at the foot of my bed, but it wasn't him anymore." Evelyn asked her what she meant, but Mrs. Brooks only shook her head and stared at the doorway. By midnight, the wing was in quiet chaos. Staff searched every room, every closet, even the maintenance tunnels beneath the building. The fog outside pressed against the windows, making the glass bead with moisture. Somewhere down the corridor, a cart tipped over with a metallic crash, but when they reached it, the hallway was empty. Shortly after 1 in the morning, Dr. Hart was summoned to the administrator's office. The hospital director, a tall, severe man named Lawrence Baird, was waiting with 2 men Evelyn didn't recognize. They wore plain suits and carried no identification, but spoke to Baird in low, clipped tones. Evelyn tried to explain about Daniel, but Baird cut her off, telling her to return to the ward and say nothing further. By dawn, every patient from the South Wing had been relocated to other parts of the hospital. Orderlies moved them quickly, not stopping to answer questions. Doors were locked, lights switched off, and by the time the sun broke through the fog, the wing stood silent. No announcement was made. No explanation given. By that evening, a construction crew had begun unloading bricks and mortar outside the sealed doors. And just like that, the South Wing was gone, hidden behind a wall that no one in the hospital would speak about again. In the weeks that followed, whispers began to seep through the hospital's corridors. Even though no official statement had been made, people noticed the change, the sudden absence of familiar patients, the strange detour signs leading Taff away from the sealed wing, the heavy silence where there had once been the sounds of footsteps and carts. Evelyn tried to carry on with her duties in the remaining wards, but the questions followed her like a shadow. Local reporters caught wind of the closure almost immediately. One of them, a persistent man named Gerald Pike from the city's evening paper, started making calls. He reached out to nurses, janitors, even former patients, trying to piece together what had happened. When the hospital's press office replied with a brief note about structural safety concerns, Gerald didn't buy it. He had seen workers hauling crates from the wing late at night, their faces set, avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed. Curiosity spread beyond the press. Some families of the relocated patients demanded answers. Mrs. Brooks's niece, a sharp-tongued woman named Caroline, phoned the administration daily, insisting on knowing why her aunt's room had been stripped over. Night, she got the same answer each time: for her safety, but no explanation of what she needed safety from. By December, a group of former patients and their relatives had started meeting at a cafe a few blocks from the hospital. They swapped stories, trying to find patterns. One man claimed his father had been in the wing when he was suddenly discharged early, his belongings returned in a plastic bag, his medical records missing several pages. Another woman swore she had seen 2 men in suits loading something long and wrapped in canvas into the back of a van on the night of the closure. Gerald Pike managed to get his hands on a partial floor plan of the South Wing, dated just 2 weeks before it was sealed. The rooms were all accounted for except one. On the blueprint in the far corner of the wing, a small square was marked only with a handwritten X. There was no room number, no description. Gerald published the floor plan in the paper alongside his article, calling it The Vanishing Room. The story caught the attention of a few curious locals, and soon, amateur investigators began lingering around the hospital grounds after dark. They'd park on side streets, waiting to see if anyone came or went from the South Wing's hidden service entrance. Security grew tighter, with guards patrolling at odd hours and floodlights installed over the loading dock. Evelyn kept quiet in public, but in private she couldn't let it go. She still had her small notebook. She still remembered the faces of the patients taken away that night. And though she had no proof, she suspected that whatever happened in that wing was not an accident of faulty wiring or unstable walls. It was something the hospital wanted gone, buried behind brick and silence, but the more people asked, the more the answers seemed to slip away. Files went missing, staff who had worked the South Wing transferred to other hospitals or simply disappeared from contact. And for those still trying to uncover the truth, the only thing more frustrating than the secrecy was the feeling that they were already too late. Whatever had been inside was gone, or worse, it was still there waiting. By the time winter deepened, the search for answers had become a maze of dead ends. Gerald Pike's articles, once bold and full of sharp questions, began to taper off. He still worked the case, but each new lead seemed to dissolve in his hands. Names he'd written down in his notebook stopped returning his calls. People who had once been willing to talk suddenly claimed they remembered nothing. A janitor who had hinted at seeing something in the South Wing one night simply packed up and left town, his apartment emptied in a single afternoon. Evelyn noticed the shift in the air in the hospital. The tension had curdled into something heavier: resignation. Staff avoided the subject entirely. Even in the break room, where rumors had once flown freely, conversations now stuck to the weather or the latest nursing schedules. It wasn't just fear. It was the kind of weariness that comes when people have learned, painfully, that pushing further will only lead them into trouble. The amateur investigators stopped showing up outside the hospital gates. The floodlights, once a glaring statement of control, now illuminated nothing but empty asphalt. The South Wing remained sealed, its windows dark. On some nights the wind rattled the loose metal siding, and from a distance it could almost sound like footsteps inside, but no one bothered to check. Anymore, Caroline, Mrs. Brooks's niece, had been one of the loudest voices demanding answers. She had filed complaints, made calls to city officials, even contacted a lawyer, but after months of hitting the same brick wall, she gave up too. When Evelyn ran into her in the grocery store one afternoon, Caroline looked tired, older somehow. "It's not worth it," she said, her voice flat. "They've made sure we'll never know." The weight of that certainty was worse than the mystery itself. It meant that the truth wasn't just hidden, it had been locked away so deliberately, so carefully, that no ordinary person could reach it. For Gerald, for Caroline, for everyone who had tried, it was like chasing a shadow that vanished the moment you got close. Weeks turned into months. The story faded from the papers, the meetings at the cafe stopped. The few who still cared spoke of it only in quiet, private moments, as if saying the wrong thing too loudly might somehow invite trouble. And yet, in the quietest parts of the night, Evelyn would still find herself replaying that evening in her mind: the hurried footsteps, the van at the loading dock, the cold rush of air as the patients were taken away. The trail was gone, the hope drained, but the unease never left. It sat in the bones of the building, in the way the South Wing loomed against the winter sky. A silent reminder that whatever had been done there, whatever had been hidden well enough to make the rest of the world forget. Almost, it was nearly a year later when the first real crack in the silence appeared. Evelyn had almost managed to push the memory of that night to the edges of her mind, where it lay dormant like a bad dream. But one rainy Thursday she received an envelope in her locker. No name, no return address, just her initials written in shaky block letters. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, clearly taken in low light. It showed a narrow room with peeling paint on the walls, and in the center, a hospital bed. On the bed lay something covered by a sheet, the outline oddly rigid, like it was strapped or bound. The angle suggested the photo had been taken through a half-open doorway. Scrawled in the corner in pen so faint it was almost illegible were 3 words: "Still here, Evelyn." She stared at it for a long time, her pulse quickening. The bed in the photograph was not from any ward she currently worked in, but the cracked tiles on the floor, she recognized them instantly. South Wing. That night she called Gerald Pike. His voice was hoarse when he answered, and she could hear the hesitation before he spoke her name. When she told him about the envelope, there was a long pause. Then, almost reluctantly, he admitted he'd received something similar 2 weeks earlier, a short, silent VHS tape left on his doorstep showing a hallway he swore belonged to the sealed wing. The camera moved shakily, turning just enough to reveal that the vanishing room on the blueprint had not been bricked over. Its door was intact and it was ajar. They met in the back booth of the cafe that had once hosted the group of curious locals. The place was quieter now, the late-night chatter replaced by the hiss of the espresso machine. Gerald laid the tape on the table between them, wrapped in brown paper. Evelyn set down the photograph, neither touched the other's offering at first. "What do you think it means?" she asked. Gerald's eyes didn't leave the photo. "It means," he said slowly, "someone in there wants us to know it's not finished." The rain outside turned heavier, blurring the glow of the streetlights through the window. They talked in hushed tones, weighing the risks, the strange timing, the possibility that it was a trap. Yet beneath the unease, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in months, a spark of urgency. By the time they left, they had agreed on one thing. Whatever was behind that bricked-up wall, someone had left a door unlocked. And if there was even the smallest chance to see what was on the other side, they couldn't turn away again. 3 nights later, Evelyn found herself standing outside the hospital long after her shift had ended. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet leaves, and the streetlights along the empty road buzzed faintly. Gerald was already there, leaning against his car, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He didn't greet her with a smile, just a small nod, as if they both knew that pleasantries had no place in what they were about to do. They'd agreed on a time when the night staff would be fewest, when the corridors would be quiet enough for footsteps to carry without being drowned. By the usual hum of activity. Gerald had managed to borrow an old set of master keys from a retired security guard he still knew, though he'd warned Evelyn not to ask how. She didn't. They slipped through a side entrance near the ambulance bay, the metal door groaning softly as Gerald pushed it open. Inside, the air felt different, thicker somehow, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. They moved quickly, avoiding the main halls, their path lit only by Gerald's small flashlight. Evelyn's heart pounded so hard she thought it might echo in the emptiness. It took less than 5 minutes to reach the corridor that led toward the south wing. The overhead lights here flickered intermittently, casting long, jerking shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air was colder. Evelyn could feel it in her lungs, sharp and biting like the draft that comes from an open cellar door. When they reached the sealed section, Gerald stopped. He pointed the beam toward the far end of the hall. There, where the blueprint had shown nothing but a solid wall, a door stood in plain sight, its paint chipped, the handle dull with age. A faint strip of light bled from the space beneath it, though it pulsed unevenly, as if it were coming from a source not quite steady. Evelyn reached for the handle, but Gerald stopped her with a hand on her wrist. "Listen," he whispered. At first she heard nothing. Then a sound so faint it was almost part of the silence, not quite a voice, not quite a mechanical hum, something in between, steady and deliberate. They exchanged a glance, no words. Gerald slid the key into the lock and with a soft, reluctant click it turned. The door eased open just an inch, releasing a wave of air that smelled faintly metallic, like old coins and something far less familiar. For a moment neither of them moved. The light spilling through the gap seemed to shift, as though something on the other side had noticed them. Evelyn swallowed hard, her pulse roaring in her ears. Whatever was waiting beyond that door had been hidden for decades, and now they were about to step inside. The hinges gave a slow, reluctant groan as the door pushed inward. The light inside wasn't electric, it shimmered in uneven waves like moonlight refracted through water. Evelyn's first thought was that the room was larger than it should have been, far deeper than the hospital's floor plan allowed. The walls curved away into shadows, lined with equipment so outdated it looked closer to something from a century-old asylum than a modern medical war. The smell hit them next, sterile at first, but underneath was something damp and lingering, a scent that clung to the back of the throat. Gerald kept the flashlight low, sweeping across the floor. A path of faded tiles led to a row of beds, each surrounded by curtains so stiff with dust they barely shifted in the draft. The nearest bed had no mattress, only a rusted frame. The next had a shape beneath a yellowed sheet. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She took a step forward and the sound beneath her shoe was softer than tile, a layer of paper. She crouched and picked one up. It was a photograph, curled and brittle at the edges, showing a man in a hospital gown staring directly at the camera, his eyes strangely blank. Dozens more photographs were scattered around, some faded beyond recognition, others disturbingly clear. From somewhere deeper in the room came a faint metallic clink, followed by a slow dragging sound. Gerald froze, his eyes darting toward the far end where the light seemed to dissolve into thick shadow. "We're not alone," he murmured. Evelyn's breath caught. She thought she saw movement between the curtains, a shape human but wrong in the way it held itself, too still as though waiting for them to make th. First move, the dragging sound came again, louder now, scraping against the floor in an irregular rhythm. Gerald shifted the beam toward it, but the light seemed to bend away, refusing to reveal what was there. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing against their skin. Somewhere behind them, the door creaked, not closing but moving, as though someone on the other side had just pushed it. Evelyn turned sharply, but the hallway beyond was empty. When she looked back into the room, the shape was gone and the sound had stopped. What replaced it was worse, a deep, drawn-out inhale, so close it seemed to come from just behind her ear. Evelyn spun around, her pulse spiking so fast she felt it in her fingertips. Nothing was there, only the dim spill of light from the doorway and the faint haze of dust floating in the air. But that breath, it had been real. Warm, deliberate, close enough to stir the hair at the nape of her neck. Gerald's jaw was tight as he stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to see what's behind those curtains." She wanted to argue, to tell him they should leave right now, but her own curiosity betrayed her. Together they moved toward the nearest bed, Gerald taking the lead. The curtain resisted as he pulled, its stiff fabric releasing a muted snap of dust into the air. What it revealed was worse than an empty bed, it was an entire setup frozen in time. A tray of medical tools lay neatly arranged, their metal dulled with age. An old glass IV bottle still hung from its stand, half filled with a cloudy liquid. Beneath it, the mattress sagged, indented as though someone had been lying there not long ago. They checked the next bed and the next. Each one felt wrong in a different way: an abandoned meal tray, a pair of slippers neatly placed on the floor, a half-written note in spidery handwriting. "NG" resting on a bedside table. Evelyn glanced at the paper, but the words didn't make sense. The letters were familiar, yet arranged into nothing she could understand. The dragging sound returned, louder this time, closer. They turned toward the far end of the room where the shadows swayed unnaturally. Something tall stood just beyond the edge of the light, its outline quivering as though it wasn't entirely solid. Evelyn's throat went dry. The thing moved, not toward them but sideways, slipping between the beds with a speed that didn't match the sound of its steps. Gerald swung the flashlight in its direction, catching only the faintest glimpse, a pale hand vanishing behind a curtain. Suddenly, every curtain in the room shifted at once, as if brushed by an unseen wind. Evelyn grabbed Gerald's arm. They were no longer sure which direction the thing had gone. And then, from somewhere in the dark, a voice, low, rasping, and almost gentle, spoke just one word: "Stay." Evelyn didn't wait to hear anything else. Her grip tightened on Gerald's arm, and together they backed toward the door, keeping their eyes on the shifting curtains. The air in the room seemed to pulse, each breath heavier than the last, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Just as Gerald reached for the handle, the dragging sound returned, only this time it was right behind them. They burst into the hallway, slamming the door shut. For a moment they just stood there, gulping in the cooler air, hearts pounding loud enough to drown out every other sound. But then, from the other side of the door came 3 deliberate knocks, slow, even, patient. They didn't speak as they made their way back through the abandoned wing, the echoes of their footsteps chased by that lingering sense of being followed. When they finally stepped outside into the sharp night air, Evelyn glanced back at the looming hospital windows. In one of them, high above, a curtain shifted, though no light was on inside, and that bricked-up wall. They never went back to see if it was sealed again, maybe some doors once opened aren't meant to stay that way. If you've ever heard stories like this or think you know what might still be in that room, let me know in the comments below. And if you want more tales of the hidden, the strange, and the forgotten, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and join me next time. Because some places don't give up their secrets easily, but when they do, you'll want to be here to hear them.